Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our podcast. My name is Melissa Briley, and I am the director for the Native American Social Work Studies Institute here at New Mexico Highlands University. And today we have a very special guest, Allison Quinones from Advocacy, Inc., a nonprofit organization stationed here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I'm going to ask Allison to go ahead and introduce herself, a brief introduction, and then we'll get started. Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Endicott Quinones, and I am the legal director of Advocacy, Inc., and we are a nonprofit that provides legal representation for children in the foster care system in New Mexico, and we primarily focus in Bernalillo County. But as a result, we represent more children in foster care than any other agency in the state. I've been doing this work within children's court. I've been working for about 14 years, and I have been a guardian ad litem for, I believe, 9 years. And so I've been working with children, I basically 0 to age 21. With all of those being individuals who were touched by the foster care system.
All right. Well, thank you, Allison. I really appreciate your time today. I have so many questions, and I really have been able to follow some of your media interviews and comments regarding the state of our child welfare system here in New Mexico. And for those of you that are not familiar with New Mexico and our child welfare system, of course, just like with other states, we have our issues. But another area of interest and consideration for some of you may be that over a year ago, the state of New Mexico also passed our Indian Families Protection Act, also known as IFPA, which is really just providing an additional layer of support or a mirror of the Indian Child Welfare Act, but more specific to the state of New Mexico. So that is one area I just want to get a couple of questions or feedback from Allison, who I consider to be a very sound legal expert, a wealth of experience here with our New Mexico courts. So Allison, I really am concerned, not only as a tribal community member, but also an instructor and a professional working as a consultant for some of our tribes in regard to Native children. But can you just share with us a little bit of how the Indian Families Protection Act is working currently in the state of New Mexico?
Well, there are a few things with regards to that. I just want to add a little bit about the history of IFPA, is that it is from the Indian Child Welfare Act passed in 1978, as you are aware, and that laid the framework for ensuring that that Native children and their cultural heritage, their tribes are all incorporated, whether or not they are practicing their tribal culture, but it's intended to ensure that there isn't more severance of those children from their tribal affiliations and cultural connections just by the nature of being in foster care, as well as you know, the long history of children being removed just for being Native. And we have a long history of that. But the problem is right now is that the Indian Child Welfare Act is being challenged in numerous states, especially states that have conservative legislatures and or governors of leadership. And so they are trying to have the law overturned based on it being somehow discriminatory against, that it is targeting one group and versus the rest of non-Native involvement in the child welfare system. And we wanted to ensure here in New Mexico that we did not lose we've already laid out many components of the Children's Code have pieces to reflect the Indian Child Welfare Act already, and we're already actually the way we practice here in New Mexico, for sure in Bernalillo County, was with a tremendous amount of influence on the importance of the Indian Child Welfare Act and how it was implemented. But we don't want to lose that here. And so the Indian Family Protection Act was passed to codify in the state all of those issues that were implemented because of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it was intended to actually strengthen that. And we're seeing that. There are a lot more regulations, there are a lot more elements that are required to ensure that the cultural piece is being reflected and enforced, and the separate needs of Native children, especially as it relates to their culture and their tribe, ensuring that those connections are intact. And actually promoting the connections that have been historically severed. So, one of the things that we see is that many, especially in Bernalillo County, we see this a lot, that they have never had a connection to their culture. A lot of these kids don't even know they have Native American heritage, and that, of course, goes back to the history of that cutting of ties that has evolved over generations, with the years and years of policy that we had in the United States that was intended to, force assimilation of some kind. And so not only does the Indian Family Protection Act, as well as our prior incarnation of ICWA that is in our New Mexico statutes, were intended to not just protect what already exists, but also to work towards making those connections that were lost previously due to years of cultural trauma. So in terms of implementation, we're still a little early in the process. Some of for lack of a better way to put it, some of the kinks are being ironed out still. And so we are doing a lot of trainings here to try to make sure that everyone, whether or not they work in, we have an Indian Child Welfare Act court specifically for cases that involve Native families to better concentrate what IFPA and ICWA are trying to provide to these families. It's to make everyone aware, because whether or not they are in that court, that specialized court, we do have a number of Native children who are not. And it is important that this be laid out in a way that can be implemented, and awareness is a huge piece of that. So we haven't had a number of trainings around the state to try to encourage that. I know that in Bernalillo County, again, where we tend to be very forward-thinking in this regard, there are a lot of pieces that were already there and are being strengthened. There are more steps in terms of notification of the courts, in terms of ensuring, for example, the Indian Child Welfare Act and the Indian Family Protection Act both require following the placement preferences, ensuring that children are placed first with their own family, and that's the family that is defined by their tribe, not just the Anglo version of what family is, where it's just sharing DNA. But we're talking about also clans and other tribal connections that, depending on, one tribe that I know of uses the term clan, but having their families that are defined by the tribes themselves, trying to make sure those connections are made, those placement preferences are met, is starting with that. And then the next step is just a Native family, not just their Native family, but a Native family within the same tribe. And then the next step is a Native family of any type, and then you go to the placement in a non-Native family or a facility of some kind. So that's a perfect example of a place we have seen strong implementation. Other pieces are still, there are others that we're working on still, but that is one that has really set in, because now it is the mandate is greater than it had been before.
Well, I think it's so important to get your perspective, your experience on IFPA. And for our listeners who are not aware or don't know some of my background, I've actually served as an expert witness in court cases here in this district within Albuquerque. I, at times, had experienced, just observing as an expert witness pieces of the courtroom, the testimony, that at times is, I guess, just to be straightforward, a little shocking in that what is truly the best interest of the child. In the field of social work, for the most part, we are taught that we are child-centered, family-focused, and that it's the child's best interest that we are looking at in order to make the best decision, not just for the present, but for the future of the child. I myself get a little concerned that at times when we have court cases where the tribe has decided not to take over a case, that they're relying on the state to proceed and to be notified, that may kind of be a little bit more of an opportunity for the full standards to be applied in such cases. I've seen children be returned and back to the family. By all means, if the parent or parents have done well and they have been able to demonstrate a safe environment for the child to return to, they've been able to meet their visitation plan, their case plan, and go through all of the necessary education and training to strengthen their parenting skills, that oftentimes those may not be long lived. They may just be a short practice, and therefore we see a child reentering into the system. So I'm oftentimes wondering or questioning whether we have this same standard of care in handling these cases, especially with tribal children from tribal communities, as we do with our non-native children entering into foster care. So I don't know if you have anything to share about that, or if you've had the same observation, but I do, as I've said, acted as an expert witness and just been a little appalled, especially if we're coming back into court with the same case or the same sibling group that are experiencing something that I may have seen a few years ago or a decade ago. So
I have, laws with the best intentions sometimes have unexpected consequences, and sometimes they're not the best consequence. One of the things that I have seen over the years has been a lowering of safety standards for Native families, because there's such a strong push to return these children home, which, I absolutely want these children to be safely reunified with their parents. And I want them to have that tribal connection and support, both for the child as well as the family. So this is not a criticism of the importance of that connection. But if the only way to be able to return that child is by lowering the requirements needed for that return, you're setting up these families for failure. And in particular, you're setting up these children for failure. When you have a situation where you have substance abuse, for example, as being the primary cause of the neglect or abuse, because, technically substance abuse in and of itself can potentially not be neglect. It's that there is a nexus between the substance abuse and the neglect, and abuse. So let's just take substance abuse as an example. Lifelong substance abuse is setting up a family for failure. And it is one of those things that even if you haven't had the neglect at that time, especially when you're dealing with some of the drugs that we're seeing more and more these days, fentanyl, for example, they are all very difficult. Addiction is very difficult to beat. I know social workers are aware of that. That's something that they work with frequently. And so it takes a very long time in order to address those issues and ensure that stability is there in terms of sobriety. In the cases I've seen as of late, the goal of reunification, in order to make that happen, sometimes that required period of sobriety is significantly shorter. And that is the circumstance where you are setting up these families for failure. By having them come out of rehab and then returning the children directly to the home with only a month of sobriety, when those are very different environments. If you can maintain sobriety in a facility, that's wonderful, but it's controlled and you're not surrounded by the stressors, you're not surrounded by the same people and communities that perhaps have facilitated or enabled that addiction. So now all of a sudden they're back they're back out of the facility, back in their average everyday life, and they haven't had an opportunity necessarily to show that they can maintain that sobriety with all of those influences. And then you add at bringing a child home, back into that home, where they're still trying to get themselves stable, and then they're now adding a stressor of a child, and then the added resources required as for raising a child. So it is a snowball effect. Some families are successful, some parents are successful with that, but many aren't. And so that is an example of where we are seeing that.
And I think that the emphasis for our listeners is that reunification, I was always taught, and of course my first supervisor in the field of social work was Dr. Evelyn Blanchard. If removal of the child or children is absolutely necessary, that the moment that you remove the next moment is to make the plan to bring them back. And what does that look like? And that is a very difficult question to answer because every family is so different. They are so different. And it's something that I teach in my courses is that our tribal communities and even our urban Indian populations are so diverse. We have families that are traditional. We have families that are ingrained in the Catholic Church, Presbyterian, atheist, what have you, and that when you're taking a pan-Indian approach to reunification and incorporating spirituality as a form of wellness or mental health and those types of non-contemporary resources, that oftentimes you are going to miss the mark on increasing the opportunity for them to get better, to take on the responsibility of their children and be able to parent effectively, or the way that, the standards that we've set forth for them. So it is very difficult. And for our social work students, at least that I've been in my courses, one thing that I always emphasize is that you have to be eclectic. You have to be pulling from various resources that you would never even imagine as part of a case plan, a treatment plan for these families, that the one size fits all template, the boilerplate plan, isn't always going to work. And for the most part, when I was doing tribal social work, I always found it challenging when having conversations with my colleagues about what a plan look like didn't fit the traditional institutional training plan, meaning that the School of Social Work plan wasn't going to work. That approach was not going to work at all. I mean, you really have to get in the weeds. And some of the example that I share often is the idea of sitting with clients that have had their children removed and really observing and listening and taking in everything that they're saying, because you may find that just through observation that this parent is unable to focus or converse with you about the issues, and that these things really take time for them to talk about, especially with strangers. So it's really important to understand that observational value in understanding how families work, the mechanics of the family. And in just saying that and sharing that with you, Allison, what are some things from a legal perspective, from a lawyer's perspective, that would help enhance social work education, especially here at the School of Social Work?
So, as it relates to Native families, if there's anything that I have seen is that if you have a Native social worker, and a good Native social worker working with a family, there is much more success. If there is, and I think that ties back into what you're describing, even if they are of Native, they have a tie to their Native culture, but they are, as you noted, an urban Indian. They haven't lived on the reservation. There still does seem to be more of the ability to trust and more of a connection. That doesn't mean that every Native worker is meeting their needs, because we definitely see a variety of competency or success. But those who really put in, those who really were working towards that goal of who have this is a Native family with generational historical trauma. I come from that same background. There's an ability to relate that the average Anglo individual doesn't. That connects with these families. And I've seen definitely better outcomes. One area where I do notice a little bit of a difference is when there is a bit of a tribal mismatch. So, for example, a Pueblo Indian family is not the same as a Navajo family. And I feel like even amongst the certainly amongst the Anglo workers, but and upper management at CYFD, everyone, there is this pan-Indian approach that everybody's the same. And if there is anything that I know from my experience is that is not true. And so when there is that sort of grouping together, and you don't just see it in this area. I've seen this in a number of areas where people are trying to be culturally sensitive, and yet they're not, because they're grouping everyone together as the exact same thing, and therefore not actually acknowledging the specific history needs of these families, and as it relates to their specific culture, you end up with that boilerplate you're talking about, and there is that lack of connection. So I did want to mention another thing that we have, and I don't mean to go back to another subject, but one other thing that I have noticed since IFPA is that CYFD's structure has changed to try to involve more individuals, involve the tribes more, honor what they have to say more and their feedback, even if they're not an intervener in the legal case. And so the combination of Kevin S. as well as IFPA has resulted in a lot more participation, engagement. There are many, there's an entire tribal affairs office now, which didn't exist before. So I have seen improvements there. I will say that one downside that, again, one of those unintended consequences is that Native children are staying in custody longer. So you have this, if tribal resources are not identified, if a tribal family is not identified, there's this unwillingness to place, or such a resistance to placing and allowing adoption with non-Native families, that these kids are languishing in care until those resources are found. So we're seeing that, so you end up with this sort of dichotomy of sorts. You want to reunify at all costs, whether or not safety is a factor, or you have let's keep them in care for a long time in order to give these families multiple opportunities. And these kids are on this roller coaster that goes on for a long time of CYFD continually working towards a reunification. And when a parent does better, you try again, and then they fall off, and then the kids are the ones who are suffering as they go through this rise and fall that ends up lasting years, rather than actually getting that permanency. Even though permanency with a Native family, especially their own family, is the goal, unfortunately, I have seen, and a lot of my colleagues have seen, this the process being prolonged. And something I think that from a social work standpoint to be aware of also is that a lot of these kids, and I mentioned it earlier, a lot of these kids were not raised in their Native culture. They don't even know that they have Native American culture. They were raised in another culture, for example, Mexican culture. That is one that I see predominantly. And they come into CYFD custody, and then all of a sudden, everyone is focusing 100% on their Native heritage because we want to encourage that, we want to strengthen that. But there is a denial of the culture that they identify with. So instead of acknowledging that and embracing that as part of who they are and that their Native culture is part of who they are, the focus tends to be just on the Native side of that child. And I have seen more and more resentment expressed by the young people in custody because they see that they're staying in care longer than their Native or than the other children around them, the non-Native children around them. They see that they are being placed with relatives that they had no idea existed just because they're family, even if they have greater ties elsewhere. They're being sent to a reservation to stay. And again, it's not that those things are inherently bad, but it's not taken into consideration that they are multicultural. And that resentment of the refusal to acknowledge the importance of that really can harm the well-being of these kids as well. I have one particular case where this, I've had multiple, but there's one in particular that comes to mind where the young person was raised primarily in a Mexican culture, mother is Native, and they had not been raised with any ties. The mother did not have really much of a connection herself, and hadn't raised them in that. And so with the focus on the Native side, no one engaged that other piece. That was so important to her. The foods, the stories, the traditions, all of that were being pushed aside in order to focus on the Native aspect of it to ensure that we were complying with the law and the spirit of the law, but the implementation itself, without acknowledging that other piece, caused so much resentment because she wasn't going to be able to get a quinceañera, which she grew up with. And that one, that while it has delayed her permanency, all these other pieces, then you tack on the fact that the other piece is being ignored. She became so resentful, she actually wrote a letter to the court stating that you don't care about who I am, and I want nothing to do with that side of myself because it has caused me harm. I am not adopted, I am stuck in custody, and I am not able to practice the traditions that I grew up with because of this Native piece, and as a result, you are doing harm to me. And so I think that recognizing that piece, that we need to embrace all of the cultures, because if you want to teach a child or teach a family or encourage their embracing that culture, you can't kill the other part. We have a lot of multicultural children here that have Native ties, but as social workers, we all need to remember that all of those pieces are make us who we are and make these children and these families who they are. So all of that needs to be tailored to, not just the pan-Native view that we see where everybody's treated the same, even the traditions are treated the same, assumptions are made about that. I mean, I see that a lot with the Pueblo tribes versus Navajo Nation. We see that a lot. trying to encourage involvement in things that are not the right culture. So there's the awareness of that, but there's also the awareness of those other cultures and how they interplay in order to strengthen, because the defensiveness will kill that tie. That feeling that they're not allowed to engage in the culture that they were raised in, and they have to sacrifice that entirely for their native culture, fosters resentment, and it harms the likelihood of success. It decreases that. So I think that's a piece that's important, is making sure that everyone remembers that.
I really appreciate what you said, and I know it could be a tough pill to swallow for some staunch advocates of ensuring identity. But I want to make sure that I emphasize to our colleagues that when you look at tribal identity down to the very basic, down to the core, is that our blood quantum are continuing to decrease. And why that is because we have more intermarriages, we have more ties to other communities, other Native groups than we did before. And that is a matter of place, where we are. The communities that we're surrounded by, it could be based on where we work, where we live, go to college, and all of these things. And that is so important to understand. But how do we cultivate this conversation, which needs to be had, about understanding who these children identify with? With the example you just provided, I too have experienced a child, and I am so deeply saddened with my experience where this young child was in foster care, not 1, not 2, but going on 3 years. No adoption, no native foster family to take him in. And eventually he graduated into the juvenile justice system. And that is not uncommon. And as an advocate and as a practitioner, as a Native person, I think that we need to continue to have these conversations. The state of New Mexico has followed suit with other states in adopting and incorporating this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wholeheartedly believe that concept, that frame has only been infiltrated into education systems and not fully injected into our workforce and other professions here in the state of New Mexico, where the state government has a hand in operations, such as CYFD. I really believe that in order for us to better understand the diversity of the clients that we serve, the communities that we work with, we really need to understand how we are fully acknowledging, in what ways are we acknowledging our community's diversity, the clients, and how we are providing a service that is equitable and that is inclusive of healing and hope for a future. That's something we definitely need to continue to work for or work towards. You also mentioned a couple of areas that I don't think I would do well in not mentioning them, which is the need for addressing a cultural continuum and understanding how culturally aware or proficient or even destructive we are as agencies providing this work to children, families. I mean, if we're really just taking a pan-Indian approach, then that's nothing. I mean, we are not demonstrating any cultural awareness or I don't think we'll ever get to a place of cultural proficiency, but we're really practicing a culturally destructive approach to child welfare if we don't acknowledge that all Native communities are different. They are so different, even our urban Indian population. A lot of the conversations I know I've had with you just on one piece of what we've talked about already, ICWA. And the need definitely to have ICWA training, a skills-based ICWA training for some of our workers here in New Mexico so that they can fully understand what ICWA is, or IFPA, how it applies to these court cases, and things maybe that we can do better to help enhance the services that we're providing to Native communities, Native families and children. But Allison, I know there have been some really big topics in the media, and I know you've addressed some of them, but we do have a couple of Big Brother programs with CYFD and some levels of oversight that have been established in the last year or so. And I want you to share with me a little bit and explain for some of our listeners who don't know or not fully aware of what these programs are, these offices, and what they're intended to do.
So there's the Office of Children's Rights, is that what you're thinking of?
Office of Children's Rights.
Okay. So the Office of Children's Rights was created within CYFD, and it is actually just part of CYFD. It is not even just administratively attached. It is part of CYFD. And that actually, I believe, came more out of Keviness than it did out of IFPA. But there is, they've come up with their Youth Bill of Rights, and it lays out numbered items that children have a right to while they're in care. They also theoretically are supposed to deal with grievances within the system that children may have, their attorneys may have, foster parents, et cetera. And so that was created. Unfortunately, it hasn't been very effective, in part because it appears, based on my experience, that they're solely focused on the Youth Bill of Rights, which is not codified. It's just something that CYFD came up with. And so, for example, I raise a serious concern about a circumstance. As I can't think of one as it relates to Native children, but let's say there's one where a worker doesn't disclose information of harm to a child and they hide it from the attorney in order to keep from getting in trouble, essentially. There was a situation I had that was similar to that. It's actually much more involved. But I go to the Office of Children's Rights and I say this child's human rights, civil rights were violated, not just by the fact that they were harmed in CYFD custody, but then there was an active cover-up of that. And the response I get is an email that says, tell us which numbers on the Youth Bill of Rights were violated. And my response was, what about civil rights? What about, the requirement that you keep these children safe? And crickets. I didn't get any response. I raised this issue with the court and in a hearing. And we were dealing, I requested a finding that no reasonable efforts were made because they didn't even meet, the CYFD didn't even meet their bare minimum requirement of keeping a child safe. And then they kept the information from me so they could allow the perpetrator of the abuse to stay in the home. And the response that I got from the court was, well, keeping children safe isn't on the treatment plan, and therefore they did make reasonable efforts. So CYFD made decisions that resulted in harm to a child and covered it up, and the court found that the boilerplate treatment plans that you talked about earlier, that is the only thing that they enforce, and that otherwise there's no requirement. I mean, the comment was, well, you should be more careful about what you put on treatment plans. The entire statute is about keeping children safe. Theoretically, or the whole code, that is the first piece, the intent is in the children's code, and that is supposed to be child-focused, keeping children safe. And yet, the court itself is not enforcing that. So the Office of Children's Rights, I think it was one of those situations where the intent may have been good, but I have not met anyone who has had an experience where, actually I've met one person who's had an experience where there was actually follow through that was something other than performative. And also, this idea is that it's supposed to provide some oversight. Well, CYFD cannot police itself. We've seen that for years and years and years. They are not following through. They have an agenda as an agency to protect themselves. I mean, that's just part of sort of the nature of any place, is that they want to be viewed in the best light. And so many of the grievances that are filed, or there's also the Office of Constituent Services, the complaints that are made to either of those tend to fall on deaf ears. That was why in the last few legislative sessions, I believe 5, there's been this push towards creating an external ombudsman, or the Office of the Child Advocate. And the idea is to have that oversight, dealing with a lot of those same issues, but from outside CYFD. So it can be analyzed without the lens of, we need to protect our agency. And the only way you're going to get change is through having that set of eyes. I mean, it's also why we focus on confidentiality, changing our confidentiality laws. Again, if you can't see it, you can't fix it. And that is where having that external piece for oversight would be helpful, as well as those changes. I did want to mention another piece. I know that I keep going back, but it's like we talk and then I think of something that I want to mention. When we were talking about the pan-Indian piece, we were talking about acknowledging the multicultural identities of these children. One of the things that CYFD does, and they have done for a while, it wasn't consistent. When I worked at CYFD, I was desperately trying to get this implemented, and that's doing a genogram. Sitting down and mapping out, what does your family tree look like? And then that's where you can find out whether they do have Native American heritage after all, what that looks like, who their clan is, that sort of thing. So that is done with the parents, but it's not done with the children. And when we are trying to make treatment plans and support children who are in foster care, and as I mentioned, they have multiple cultures that are important to them. And so seeing what their identity is, not just their parents, but what they see in terms of their culture, I think is very important. And we don't do that. We don't work directly with the children. We talk a good game about wanting to empower kids, but when it comes down to it, the decisions that are being made are not necessarily being done with their thoughts, their interests in mind, and what their, like I said, identity piece is. And I think it's really important to note that all of our structures seem to be parent-focused and not child-focused, and we've lost that. This whole system is supposed to be child-centered, but there's been this move away, and that's part of that is because of the way our statutes are written, where there are repercussions for not meeting the parents' needs, but there are no repercussions for not meeting the child's needs. So when you have an individual with a caseload that is just enormous, they don't have, they have to pick and choose. What am I going to support? What am I not? What will I get in trouble for and what I won't? And it's the children who are left to languish. And so getting to know these children, making sure that their cultural identity is taken into consideration and their voice in that's how we're going to strengthen these ties. If you are, I joke around about how I'm vegan, and as a vegan, there are different approaches you can take in terms of educating others, because that's really important. You can either scream in somebody's face and say, murderer, murderer, you kill baby, whatever, lambs, or and you immediately put people on the defensive and they want nothing to do with you. They will push back, if anything worse than their original sense of how they felt, because they're feeling attacked. Or you can take the approach of you don't sit and talk to them while they're stuffing their face. You talk to them on their own. You answer their questions. You provide them with information. You're a lot more likely to, and you acknowledge where they're coming from. This is what you grew up with. Here's how some of the information is actually different than what you learned. And that is where you start to make headway, in my view. And I feel like there's a degree of that with, kind of on the flip side of that with Native children and families. If you say you are Indian and that's it, sorry, I'm banging on your table. When you say, you're Native and that's it, and we're not going to acknowledge your other culture, you're putting these kids on the defensive. They feel that they have to fight for their own culture. They feel resentful of something being foisted upon them, that instead of educating them, we acknowledge your culture. You have another culture. Isn't this cool that you have another identity? Would you like to learn about it? The kids who have it approached that way are much more apt to want to learn, embrace, and their culture, their native culture, than those who feel like it has been crammed down their throat without any feedback from them. And the parents are like that as well, I've seen. Not as often as it is with the children, just by the nature of it. So I know that I went a little bit backwards on that, but I wanted to mention that because I think it's another piece that's important.
All right. Well, I think we're about out of time here, but Allison, I really want to thank you for all of the good work that you're doing for our families here in New Mexico, and for all of the good work. I know that sometimes you have to say what you need to say, and it may not be the popular thing, but it is. What I always say, what's popular isn't always right, and what's right isn't always popular. And I think you do a heck of a job for our families, and I truly appreciate all of the work you do. So thank you for joining us. I do want to invite you to come back because I do want to talk to you at some time regarding foster care. So, and our juvenile justice system, and get your perspective on how that's working for us here in New Mexico. So everyone, thanks again for joining us and welcoming our guest, Allison Endicott Quinones, and we look forward to having her back.
Thank you very much.